गुड मॉर्निंग एंड वेलकम टू गनर शॉट। गनर शॉट में आप सबका स्वागत है। एंड ऑफ कोर्स इट्स गुड इवनिंग इन इंडिया। टुडे we're going to talk of NATO. NATO at 75. NATO, as we all know, started at the end of the Second World War, basically against it as an organization to counter the Soviet threat. But then it's gone through 75 years. To talk about this and more, we have with us Ambassador Gurjit Singh. Sir, morning, good evening, and welcome to Gunner Shot once again. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk about
Thank you.
NATO.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Right. Uh, Before we start, I'd like to just give a heads up to the viewers. Like I said, NATO has been in existence for 10 years. Initially, it started as a set of just about 12 countries. Over a period of 75 years, there have been 10 expansions, and it's gone up to 32 members, and aiming to go more. And it's on the verge of expanding into Asia, right? And that's the latest discussion in NATO. But then, after 75 years, there are a lot of issues. First, there are issues whether NATO is relevant in today's world, and if NATO wants to leave the North Atlantic and come to the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Western Pacific, what should its nature, role, and organization be, and what it is doing, its relevance, a lot of issues. And I'm sure our ambassador will throw light on all these. I'll not, stand between you and the ambassador. Sir, I'll defer to you. All yours. Please take it on from here.
Thank you, General Shankar, and always a pleasure to be on Gunner's Shot for a freewheeling discussion. So, NATO at 75. NATO is now 75 years old, and they had a summit in Washington on 10th July. The most significant part of this summit was that I think people realized that NATO is younger than President Biden. President Biden is 81. NATO is only 75. NATO is young compared to Biden. So the focus of the summit became, can Biden deliver a cogent speech without fluffing anything? And if he can, that will mean that he can be a good presidential candidate. Now, this sounds funny, but I think every NATO leader who was in Washington was watching Biden carefully, because the results of the November United States election are going to have an impact on NATO, its members, and the direction they are going in. Now, I'm going to talk more about what's happening now, and I'll go back into history a bit. Right now, NATO is the largest ever. You said 32 countries. It's huge. 55% of the world's defense expenditure is from NATO countries. But remember that in 1945, when the World War II ended, it's only France and the UK which got together and said, we must find ways to prevent Germany from coming up again, and if necessary, also deal with the Soviet Union. So by the time World War II ended, the ally Soviet Union was now also becoming a rival. By the time of the Potsdam Conference, this was evident. And Churchill, as president, I think, said that an iron curtain has now come down in Europe. And that was the signal that the Cold War started. So from Britain and France, they added the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and a few others, and formed what is still called the Western European Union. Nobody remembers this now. It still exists. By 1949, when the United States decided that it was going to play a bigger role in the post-war world, it formed NATO. So NATO has, originally when you said 12, it had 10 European countries and 2 North American countries, uh, United States and Canada. There was no country from Asia in NATO because the remit of NATO was Europe, where World War II was largely fought. So the other enemy country, Japan, was not as part of NATO's purview. Now, at that time, NATO had partner institutions. One was called SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Now, that had the United States, Australia, New Zealand, it had Thailand and Philippines. And then they had CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, which had Pakistan, Turkey, Iraq, pre-revolution Iraq, United States. But these two organizations did not stand the test of time, mainly because of regime changes within some of their partners. But Australia and New Zealand remained US partners from a 1951 alliance called ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, United States. And from 1947 or so, Japan remains a military ally under a treaty. And after 1950 and the Korean War, the Koreans, South Koreans also became ally. But these allies, ANZUS, Japan, and Korea, were not allied to each other. They were not allied to NATO. They were allied to the United States. And that situation remains. Now, what happens is that NATO is a collective defense organization which has two important articles, 5 and 4. 5 says an attack on any member will be considered an attack on the others, and we will immediately get together and hammer the enemy. Article 4 says if there are security threats, then a member can call for consultations. The first time such consultations were called was when the Korean War took place, 1950. But it did not lead to NATO action. In fact, to cut the long story short, all through the period of the Cold War, and this goes on till the Berlin Wall falls in 1989 and the Soviet Union disintegrates in 1991 and the Cold War ends, and so does the Soviet Union. In all this period, there is no call to use Article 5 and there is no NATO military action ever. All through the period of extreme relevance of NATO to fight and counter the Soviet Union. Article 5 invoked, as I said, just once, and that too consultations, and that's it. Now, you mentioned 10 expansions. Countries like Spain and Portugal returned to democracy in the 80s. So they joined NATO. So NATO kept absorbing people. But in 1955, the Soviet Union created a rival, Warsaw Pact, which had Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, which were then part of Soviet Union. But I hope our listeners know this, that Ukraine and Belarus were one of the 15 states of the Soviet Union, but they had a seat in the United Nations all this time. So these countries plus the East European countries formed the Warsaw Pact, and the Iron Curtain was in East Germany, which was separated, and then Poland and the Iron Curtain were there, dividing the Soviet allies from the NATO allies. This Cold War did not directly impact the allies in Asia. Japanese had their own problem with Russia over the northern territories, islands. Korea had a problem with North Korea, which is a Russian ally. The Australians and New Zealanders were never quite clear what problem they had with anybody. So to find what their problem was, they always looked to Washington to find out where is my problem. And then they would follow. So you know that Australians, New Zealanders fought in World War II, they fought in Korean War, they fought in many places. Now, the NATO has a political wing and a military wing. The headquarters are in Brussels, in Belgium, which is also the headquarters of the European Union. But today, NATO has more countries than the European Union. European Union has been far more circumspect about taking in East European countries, but NATO had no compunction. They just kept taking everybody. So today, except for Belarus and Ukraine and Georgia, Armenia, what I call the Caucasus outposts, Azerbaijan, everybody else is in NATO. Now Finland and Sweden have also joined. But everybody is not in the European Union. I mean, there are so many. Romania is, but Albania and many of these other countries on the periphery of old Yugoslavia and are not in European Union. But NATO countries include North Macedonia, they include Albania. I mean, everybody is there. NATO is a US-led alliance. The US paid for everything. The US decided everything. But the first time Article 5 was actually used is in 9/11/2001, when the Twin Towers were bombed. At that time was the first time that the US invoked Article 5, saying that an attack on me is an attack on NATO. So all NATO forces then got together and said, off we go to fix Afghanistan. So let's talk of Afghanistan, the most potent NATO action ever, but it happens 2 years, almost 10 years after the Cold War ends. And all NATO countries are there. In fact, more than NATO countries, others are also sending troops, Mongolia and others. NATO has partner countries of different shades. So everybody sent to 42 countries sent troops. For a long time, the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, which was UN sanctioned, was taken over by NATO. And Germany ran it for a while, but Denmark and Netherlands, everybody had contingents there. And they had casualties. Now, when you look at this operation, can you call it a success? And my answer is no. Because when they withdrew in 2021 and left in sense of bravado, they basically handed Afghanistan over to the Taliban. As NATO was running away, the Taliban was coming in. So I would say that their biggest NATO operation ever ended in political failure. I mean, the same people you wanted to exit, you brought them back. However, if you look at the political angle of NATO, I would say that the end of the Cold War, the breach of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the fall of the Soviet Union were all political successes. Now, you may call them ideological, you may say it was a Western democratic led, but the point is NATO played a role in that. It did not have to fight, but it brought a solidarity and to the countries of the Warsaw Pact when they left the Soviet Union, they wanted to join the European Union. But when they found those doors not easy to open, they decided to join NATO, which was much easier. And it was a low cost option. Please remember, when all these countries joined, they didn't have to pay anything. But to European Union, they all have to not only adapt their values, but also make payments. And they will get return. But it is a sense of responsibility. Whereas from NATO, they got a sense of security. Now, NATO suddenly goes into action even before 2001 when Yugoslavia breaks up. So in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, there are varied NATO actions, mostly airstrikes and UN mandated. There were some botch-ups. I think for the first time, a NATO plane, a British Tornado, was shot down by the Serbians. So they suddenly found that everything doesn't quite work the way they wanted. Subsequently, again in 1999, around the same time, suddenly, they are getting very aggressive. They get involved in Libya. They try to get involved in Iraq, in Syria, in many places. But none of these are NATO operations, though Article 4 is used. But countries like Germany, France, and others often don't agree that these are NATO responsibilities. So some NATO countries get together and act in Libya. Some get together, act in Syria in different times. Some act in Iraq. Iraq, huge operation, Desert Storm and subsequent, but none of them are NATO operations, mainly because the Germans didn't agree. So the Americans use NATO for their policy purposes when required and capable, and when not, they simply use the willing countries. This period of NATO aggressive action in the late 90s culminates in the 2001 deployment in Afghanistan. None of these problems which they went into have been resolved. Libya still in a state of civil war. Syria not resolved. Iraq remains messy. Afghanistan not resolved. So the efficacy of NATO is not proven, but yet more countries want to join it, like Sweden and
England.
Yeah. So now the thing is that many countries in NATO think that NATO should not be going outside Europe. Why are we going to Afghanistan? Why are we going to Syria, Libya, this, that? I mean, there was a time when anti-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea were undertaken by NATO flotilla, but they were never successful. Piracy kept happening. It was ultimately Eurofor, a European force, along with India and others, which managed to turn the back on piracy. It was never NATO as such. So NATO was selectively used by the United States. In the 1970s, in 72, Detente begins with the Soviet Union. But in 1975, Soviet Union is interfering in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, other places who are trying to get free from Spain. The Russians are there trying to make sure that the governments which emerge are favorable to them. But you don't see the Americans calling in NATO to halt Soviet action in Africa. For them, détente in Europe was more important. That is why extra European operations have always been by American choice. Today, what is troubling us is the fact that America once again wants to take NATO beyond Europe into Asia, our Asia. NATO revitalization does not come because of Chinese aggressive intent in Asia. That is not NATO remit or remedy. NATO has been revitalized by the invasion
Ukraine.
of Ukraine by Russia. And suddenly, NATO aggregated the Europeans behind them. It rebuffed the Europeans' engagement with Russia in trade for energy and security. It ditched the Minsk process and simply said, we will do it my way. The European strategic autonomy was felled by NATO's resolve. So the traditional European countries, the original 10, their view of NATO is a bit different. They would like autonomy. They would like to deal with China and Russia on their own terms. But the new members of NATO, particularly the East Europeans, they are more apprehensive and anxious about Russia than, say, Germany or France was. So they always wanted NATO to take a hard stance against Russia. But not all. This fellow Orban in Hungary is actually pro-Putin. So there are differences in European approach to Russia, but the Americans have pulled all that down and brought everybody behind them and say Russia is enemy number one. In this, they have also enforced larger defense spending by the Europeans. Since about 2014, and particularly during the Trump era, he said that all the NATO fellows and Japan and Korea and Australia not spending enough on defense. And they must spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. I think in 2014, there were only 11 NATO countries which reached that 2%. Most of them were the small countries or the East Europeans who had small GDPs. But today, in 2024, and during the last summit, Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, announced that out of 32, 23 countries have already attained the 2% of GDP expenditure on defense threshold. So you see how much it has changed. The Americans are contesting Russia using more European money. Where is the European money going to go? Now, if you look at their defense forces, they were trying to use European equipment, even though it is not standardized. Everybody in Europe is not using Leopard tanks from Germany or the Tornadoes or the Typhoons or the Eurofighters. I mean, there are many Rafales. But one consequence of increased expenditure is go to America and buy more weaponry. So F-35s are coming in much bigger way into Europe than, let us say, the Eurofighters or I think the Typhoons are on their last legs. So American military industrial complex is getting paid by European expenditure like it is getting paid by increased Japanese expenditure. Second part is that at this summit now, for the first time, they had a NATO defense exhibition. And there, they got a commitment from all NATO countries that they will now coordinate their military industrial complex. So the budget target 2%, they think they have done. Now is to get them all to coordinate their military industrial complex, because the Ukraine war is not only depleting Russian war material, it is depleting European supplies. The Europeans, in any case, had no big armies or no big stockpiles. So a war of 1 year is enough to deplete them. So in order to replenish that, they want to get in the European industry more involved in defense. And the third aspect which now they are focusing is greater coordination of equipment, communications, and tactics among NATO forces. I mean, there is a European doctrine. There are European countries having their own, communication system, their own tank, their own. Now they are saying, let's coordinate more. During the period of de Gaulle as the French president, France withdrew from the military coordination aspects of NATO and said, we don't want to come and we want to remain independent and we will have our own nuclear deterrent. The British never said that. But a few years ago, I think when Sarkozy was president, France has returned to NATO. Now, this is pre-Ukraine. It's not anything got to do with Ukraine. So France is now back in NATO and now will be part of these coordination, military industrial complex, all these issues. In all this, now if you see, and now I come to the concern, is that since 2022, which is the year after Ukraine happens, NATO summits start inviting the IP4, Indo-Pacific 4 countries, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand. New Zealand the most reluctant. And Japan, Australia, US and India are part of the Quad. But India doesn't go to NATO, but the other four, what are now called IP4, since 2022 are attending EU summits in Madrid, then in Lithuania, and now in Washington. The ministers from these countries have been participating in NATO conferences for longer. Now, for all of us in the Indo-Pacific, China is the main threat, not Russia. But since 2022, the Americans have roped in their allies in Asia to say you have to be part of this whole effort. So they have become very vocal and critical, putting sanctions on Russia and everything. But at the same time, hoping that one day the Americans will always also wake up to the threat of China, which the Japanese face in the Senkaku Islands, the trade aspect that and South Pacific that Australia faces, and India, of course, faces. Now, there are two reasons why in this summit, finally, China is named as a problem by NATO. And these reasons, unfortunately, are not the threat that China poses to our region. The reasons are, one, that China threatens to take over Taiwan. And therefore, the Taiwan crisis means that I need the support of regional powers who are my allies, who must therefore work with NATO to give it a cogent response. And why NATO is important? Because China is now backing Russia fully, and their backing is helping Russia continue the Ukraine war. For the same reason, North Korea and Iran and Belarus are also mentioned as negatively in the NATO at 75 declaration. Why? Because they're all supporting Russia. They don't say Iran is bad because it supports terrorism or whatever. No. They want to support Russia. So on that line, if you support Russia, you're going to get named. I think India should consider itself lucky that we didn't get named. Because when the summit was taking place, PM Modi was actually in Moscow. At the same time, India, they are circumspect. They don't invite India to NATO because they know India will not. So today, the industrial might of the IP4, particularly Japan and Korea, is sought to be marshaled to replenish NATO's military stock. Japan and Korea are being told increase defense production. You will need it. You need to pay more. It always Americans will not come. And please produce enough so we can use it against Russia also. So this is where the IP4 are now playing a bigger role. India is uncomfortable with this. We agree with the Americans in the Quad on the Indo-Pacific. But I think we understood the limitations of our strategic congruence with the United States in the manner in which they ran away from Afghanistan without asking us, and we had been a good ally to them in Afghanistan. And I already discussed how NATO dispersed from there in a very unprofessional manner. So we realized that there is no global congruence with the United States and consequently with NATO. I think with Japan, we have more global congruence. With Australia, we have a regional congruence. With South Korea, we are trying to find one. With New Zealand, we don't agree on anything because we don't buy their milk. And New Zealand foreign policy is largely buy my milk. So India does not have that congruence, and India does not believe that European problems are Asian or Indo-Pacific. So don't bring me your Russian problem because it's not my problem. And I don't have that much of a problem with Russia. But the other IP4 seem to be quite happy to go along. Now, this will create a divergence on how we approach NATO and Europe among the countries of the Indo-Pacific. India has gradually moved Quad from looking like a military organization to a public goods organization. If you look at the last two summits documentation, it is all about public health, digital, finance, is that. We don't talk military, and that is what gives ASEAN comfort. It gives South Pacific comfort. Because none of them want to get involved in a US-China, US-Russia combat. Neither does India. But if our friends in this region are quite adept to say, okay, we'll go along with NATO, then how far is it before NATO comes into our country, our territories? Now here I think we need to look at two contemporary points. About a year ago, NATO announced that they will open an office in Tokyo. The French struck it down, saying no, Article 4 consultation not carried out. So that office was not opened, but the direction was clear. The second aspect is that more and more the EU, Canada, and several European countries, France, Germany, Netherlands, even Lithuania, have an Indo-Pacific outlook. So their interest in Indo-Pacific is growing. But this was not growing for our reasons. It was not growing to counter China. It was growing to expand their economic interface in the search for larger markets in the Indo-Pacific. These Europeans did not want to be seen as military powers. But Given the militarization of the Indo-Pacific, today Germans are counted on how many ships they are sending and how frequently. The British on how many flotilla they send, how frequently. The same with the French. And now you see all these European NATO countries participating in frequent exercises in the Indo-Pacific. There is RIMPAC, the largest maritime exercise happening off Hawaii and Guam, led by the United States. This year, Japan is doing 3 exercises with Germany, Spain, France, Italy. I think they are called Pacific Skies or something. The Australians are doing, what do they call it? Pitch black with many of these countries. Of course, India is also involved. And India is also doing its own exercise in Jodhpur with many of these countries. So where is the difference? If India is also working with them and they're also coming to Indo-Pacific, the difference is we are not interacting with them as NATO countries. We are not subscribing to NATO doctrine. We are not subscribing to an anti-Russian propaganda. We are working to enhance security in the region, create a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the code word for keeping China under control. The Europeans don't say anything about China, but if they work with us, this compatibility, interoperability, and all these things will help in times of crisis to deal with either HADR or non-traditional threats and even China. So I think this is where the situation is. NATO is deeply interested in coming to the Indo-Pacific because that is the American dream. And America's allies do not find it feasible to resist that. But India, strategic autonomy, ASEAN strategic autonomy, make sure that we should not have, we can have friendly government, we can have the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, but we don't want to call it a NATO force. And we don't want it to work under NATO objectives. They must work on our common objectives. And this is where I believe NATO at 75 will test India's strategic autonomy to the utmost. I'm going to stop here and happy to take this.
Thanks a lot, sir. First and foremost, the first question I have is, will NATO survive itself? Why I'm asking, because NATO's, as we've discussed, grown into a large organization from 10 countries to 32 countries, 3 more in the wings like Ukraine and all that. And plus, NATO is expanding its footprint into the Indo-Pacific along with the IP4. At the same time, you have a system where the underpinning force of NATO is US, there's no doubt. And with Trump likely to come in, the way things are, and if Trump comes in, let's put it this way, NATO concept itself might undergo a change because of the way Trump thinks. So in that case, will NATO survive itself? And if it has to survive itself, it has to reinvent itself. And like you rightly said, one of the reasons why it is entering here is its other interests into Indo-Pacific. So isn't it become too large and too amorphous to survive itself, or it has to reinvent itself? I like your views on that. My question is itself amorphous, but the situation itself is like that. So you have broader views, and then I'll come to India.
So, I believe that when a country seeks influence, it is only circumscribed by its own ambition. So nothing is too big. NATO for a resurgent United States is still not enough. But when you take action like you've taken now against Russia, some people say you provoked them in Ukraine, then you reach some limitations. You have curbed the strategic autonomy of Europe, but it's not forever. old Europe will want to stand up on its own. And this time they will be better armed because you have let the 2% of defense genie out of the box. Now, would Trump curtail NATO? Last time around, when he was there, he basically said, you guys are getting a free ride, so pay up. Now they are paying up. If he took less interest in NATO, the European Union elements of NATO will take charge. But as I said, they are now armed or getting armed, getting there. They have broken that jinx of not spending on defense. Second, there is speculation that the first casualty of a Trump administration will be Ukraine. And he will end the war with Russia on some terms. I think that will mean that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. But Russia will never agree to that. Or, for that matter, European Union. That could be a casualty. And if that happens, the war ends, then NATO does not need to keep jibing Russia. But again, it frees old Europe, the European Union, from having to counter Russia and go back to perhaps trying a trade for security arrangement, energy arrangement, which at the moment their sanctions don't allow that. The bigger danger is what will Trump do with China? Last time, Trump showed little interest in the Indo-Pacific. He never went to any East Asia summit. He did not come to ASEAN. But he did impose tariffs on China. Now, is he going to work towards trying to control China with the help of allies? Or will he just put the Taiwan issue in a freezer and then end the animosity for now? I am not certain. If Taiwan issue does not exist, why does America need to push Japan, Korea, Australia up? They're not going to do it for ASEAN. So, President Trump administration priority will be to de-escalate Taiwan. If in the consequence of that, they lose interest in ASEAN, it may happen. Therefore, just as Europe may step out of the American shadow and start dealing with Russia differently, it would be time for India, Japan, Australia, Korea to step out of American shadow and deal with the Indo-Pacific separately. That's what my answer is.
So, are we looking at, should India start looking at dealing with China militarily in some form? Might not be a treaty, might not be anything, because using the Western Pacific nations like Japan, Korea, Philippines,
No,
Australia.
you mean to counter them or to just have a deal with them?
You have a deal with them to counter the China threat, because NATO is now going to be an uncertain organization. And, they don't have.
NATO is not helping us with China in any case. Even nobody is helping us with China. Russian equipment still is the main. There's more American equipment, French equipment coming, but they don't transfer technology. But those have their own problem. Diversification of India's defense acquisition has its own problems. I think the lack of trust with China after what happened in Ladakh in 2020 is so high that we can't trust any agreement with them. But I still remain in favor that we can't remain in a state of perpetual katti. We have to talk and talk politically. The large number of military negotiations on the border have not led to success. We need to escalate it. You need to do a trade-off somewhere, negotiate, create ambience. I mean, after Doklam, you had those two summits in Wuhan and in Mahabalipuram. The problem is that China thinks that India is growing rapidly and must be curbed. So if you are going to deal with these Chinese restrictions on us, then yes, we must deal with Japan, Korea, Australia more cogently to hold a free and open Indo-Pacific, which will be then an ankush on some of China's ambitions.
Right. The next question I have is, okay, we know US is coming through NATO into the Indo-Pacific, and that's the general aim as one can see. At the same time, Indo-US strategic partnership is also largely, aimed at China. How do we balance this imbalance out? While US is operating on multiple lines, we don't seem to be operating on multiple lines. Should we open up other options other than US? Or rather, how do we do it?
No, I think we are working like a juggler with many balls in the air. But all balls are not of the same size, which is why it becomes difficult. So, India wants a multipolar world. And in this multipolar world, Europe should be an independent pole. That is why you look in the last 10 years how much we cultivated Europe. But under American pressure, they all just went behind them, dumped their own autonomy. The Russians were a good pole for us, still are. But they have also shot themselves in the foot by first invading Ukraine and then not doing it efficiently. We would like ASEAN to be a pole, but they seem to think that having a Chinese engagement on economics and an ambivalent security arrangement with everybody else is adequate. Now, we can't act like ASEAN. We have a live border. So we need more cogent attributes. So we have to juggle these balls. So while the Americans are important, the French are important, we are trying to get the Spanish, the Germans, the Italians, the British interested in us, the European Union. How much more? Where do you find more allies? I mean, there's Australia. What defense support can Australia give you? Neither intelligence nor defense production. Japan, neither intelligence nor defense production. But you can come together to guard the Indo-Pacific as part of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Korea can play a bigger role in our defense. Already some of our equipment is joint ventures with Korea. I mean, I hope one day Japan would do that with us. But finding willing allies to work with you in the military sphere, whether for providing intelligence or providing defense production activity, is not so easy. There are not that many balls to juggle. So therefore, the US will remain important to us.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, sir. The net of what you've spoken today is NATO will not fall away. In fact, after all the investment which it has done in itself, with all the defense spending, they'll only grow stronger. But will they be Indo-Pacific centric? They will not be. They will only ride or rather fall behind US interests, which in this case between NATO and India, because NATO is still an alliance organization, we have an issue. But the next point is we need to grow on our own if we have to navigate through this multilateralism. And we have to balance the imbalances created with our friendship with Russia and US. And that's something which we're going to talk of later in the week right? So we'll do that. So we have to grow stronger. And the fundamental of that is growth in our own defense capability and production. And the moment you have that and not be completely dependent on outside powers, right? Like we are now dependent still on Russia and on US to a large extent, I think we'll start finding our feet better. And then we will have a better way of dealing with China. Because one of our biggest problems today in dealing with China, the way you said, to have a political dialogue with China, is lack of our defense capability. I might be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong in this case. Well, sir, be that as it may, I'll take a few questions from the viewers, and we'll see, okay, where we go from there. Vishwanathan says, Sir, has the war in Ukraine not damaged Ukraine's demography and economy irreversibly? What can the long term implication on NATO's reputation as a balancer be? Will the next generation Europe accept and continue with NATO in the existing form given rapidly changing geopolitics, global geopolitics and economy? You want me to put the first question back? I'll do that. The first part of the question.
Okay. Has the war in Ukraine damaged Ukraine's demography? It has.
It has.
In fact, if after the war ends, Ukraine will find that the Russian speaking population will increase for it to survive. Economy, I think post war, the reconstruction of Ukraine can bring in a lot of economic benefits, like Ivory Coast, for instance. Long-term implication on NATO's reputation as a balancer. I think today I told you so many failures of NATO. It didn't seem to hurt it in any way. Will the next gen Europe accept and continue with NATO? I don't know. But I think if US takes less interest in NATO, NATO and the EU will start becoming more congruent and show more resilience towards European strategic autonomy.
Yeah. The next question, sir, is okay. Let's take this. On the question of how long will NATO survive, isn't one simple answer is NATO will survive as long as white racism and white assumption of global imperialism will survive. Though it's a bit extreme, but I think there's some truth in this whole story.
Well, if you look at the way European countries are becoming less white, more Muslim,
Yeah.
I am not certain. Okay, let's put it this way. If you have an Indian Prime Minister of Britain, is he going to take them out of NATO? He didn't. So I don't think this necessarily adds up. Whatever demographic changes in European countries or in Canada for that matter, I don't think this will alter their association with NATO.
Right, sir. Then, okay, the other thing, right, sir. I don't see any more questions, but let me ask you, then from a discussion point of view. Assume that Trump comes in as president, seems to be quite likely, and which is the general mood prevalent in USA also. Assuming that he comes to power, and if he winds down the Ukraine war, and if he's never had interest in Taiwan, supporting Taiwan militarily, which he has not shown, will it not be self-defeating for NATO and US interests? And will that be accepted by the US system as against the individual view of the president, who might have to eventually see the logic of the whole story, feeding off his own economy and the defense industrial complex?
So, one theory says that the US creates wars so that its military industrial complex can thrive. But traditionally, the military industrial complex was meant to be Republican. So, why is it that it is the Democrats who back the war? And now we think the Republicans will stop it. So, I think just as in Europe there is a shades of gray, I think between the Democrats and Republicans also there are shades of gray. Trump is not purely political party. He's Trump. And he takes his own decisions. And I think he looks at things economically. So if there's going to be a peace deal in Ukraine, he will get American companies the lion's share of Ukraine reconstruction most of which will be paid for by the European Union. So there is advantage for him out of that.
Fine, sir.
And same in Taiwan, if he stops Taiwan, the benefits. See, I think the reason that the Americans keep tom-tomming this Taiwan crisis is because they want to make American forces stronger. Because they believe they are not strong enough to actually hold the Indo-Pacific, the Central Command, and everything else at one time. So, like we talk of China, the entire plethora of articles about how strong the Chinese Navy has become is actually reasoning to strengthen the American Navy, which they say is falling behind, or for space or whatever. So I think these are reasons there. I personally don't think Taiwan is going to be attacked, but I think the question which I would like to ask: what will India do in the case of a Taiwan crisis?
Yeah, that's $1 million question, sir.
So if
That's a
they
$1
say
million
this is
question.
action, India will take no action. If they say it is a request by Americans under our bilateral arrangements, I think India will give facilities in our ports and airports for equipment and supplies to go on the Taiwan part. But I don't think India will allow military use of bases like, say, Philippines will. But in any case, we are too far for that.
So my own view on this, this Taiwan issue and India issue is a little different. Or, strengthening strategic partnership with USA is to put some pressure and even pose a threat, that's the way Chinese see it, on the Chinese western flank, right? To deter it from going to Taiwan. Similarly, the Chinese support to Taiwan, right, deters China from coming towards India. In fact, actually, if you really look at it, China today is caught on the horns of a dilemma where it can go. It attempted to come towards India and settle that border in 2020 because it had the flank, that southern flank, protected by COVID and a lot of American assets down due to COVID. It attempted that. Having failed there, now it is stuck. So I think the larger issue of India-US cooperation and our support to Taiwan is more for deterrence purposes than from execution. And as long as this deterrence continues, I think the execution doesn't matter. In fact, we'll never come to it, and we are probably doing a good job of it even now. I'd like your view on that.
So India does a good job in defending itself to the best of its ability, yes. Is that ability adequate to hold China back? No. Have we leveraged Tibet and Taiwan? No. We don't talk about the one China policy, but I don't think we are poking our nose either into Taiwan or Tibet for that matter. I don't think we want a war with China. But I don't think China hits you at times only to test your military capability. I think it hits you to keep us under check so that our own potential for becoming a big power is curtailed. That is what they try to do. And that will remain till what you mentioned earlier. We become more Atmanirbhar in our own defense and technology, so we are not dependent on others. But besides that defense and technology, General Saab, I believe we must become a great trading power. Our foreign trade is one of our weakest links. Without that, you cannot become a great power. So I think these, I would say, are.
No, I completely agree with you, sir. Foreign trade is, I think, the cornerstone of India trying to become a great power or attempting to become a great power. And a good part of that foreign trade is building military alliances. And a good part of the military alliances is dependent on military exports. After all, if you see how is NATO bound together, NATO is bound together through NATO standards. And what are NATO standards? NATO standards are fundamentally American standards by which all the NATO countries are forced to buy American equipment. Not all, but most of their American equipment. That is why, which you rightly said earlier, 2% of the defense expenditure, at least 50% of that goes back into the defense industrial complex of USA and makes it economically well off. And that is what I think we are missing. It is not only a matter of becoming Atmanirbhar, we need to develop military linkages and military economic linkages with those countries which we feel like the one which we have done with Philippines. That's only one off. Like the one we're doing with maybe Armenia, which we need to increase this defense footprint. We need to increase this. This is my view.
Very
With
much.
at least our neighbors, right? And one economic linkage will lead to another. That's a natural flow, which I think we need to factor this in our foreign policy and our defense policy also.
Fully,
And we
I agree
need to
with
have some congruence between our external and defense policy, but that's a matter which we will discuss another time. So,
you. If
uh,
you can have
yeah,
a good amount of domestic production, whether military or non-military, you can become a potent power.
yes, that's the crux of the whole show. The last question I'll take, sir, and then we'll wind up, is does India need a mutual defense pact with another country, which no one, with which one and why and by when?
So, the mutual defense pacts were a part of the bipolar period. So, when the Americans were backing Pakistan fully around 70, I think, we signed the Indo Soviet Treaty. And I think later we signed such a treaty with Bangladesh. And despite extensions, I think both those treaties have disappeared. So today you actually don't need treaty because, as I said, we are juggling a large set of balls. And what's the point of having a treaty with the Russians? They can't give you everything you want. They can't even fulfill their contracts on S-400. They did not consult you before going to Ukraine. What's the point of having a mutual defense treaty with the US? They will not consult you even on Afghanistan, which is your neighborhood. So I think it is better to keep your options open, deal selectively with countries on equipment, on policy, on strategy, align where you want, stay autonomous where you want.
Where you want. Yeah, I think that's a very logical way of putting it and sensible way of doing things if we want to be strategically autonomous. Sir, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful exposure and wonderful discourse on NATO, where we brought in a lot of different things, from different angles. We've discussed this whole thing. Uh, it poses a lot of questions to India as to how to deal with its own future. And we need to think differently as we have to progress. The things which we did earlier won't stand us in good stead because it's just not a India China affair anymore. We have to think of India China, we have to think of India Russia, and we have to think of India Middle East, which we have not factored in today. And then, of course, we have to look at our own neighborhood. I think going ahead, we have a lot of rethinking to do on our economic, diplomatic, and military outlooks as a whole. With this, sir, thanks once again. I'm sure later in the week we will meet and discuss this issue with Russia. After that, we are meeting on 19th. I'd request all viewers to join us on 19th at the same time where we're going to discuss India and Russia. And as a result of the last visit of the PM to Russia. Thank you, sir. Good evening and
Good
Jai Hind to
evening.
you, sir.
Thank you, Jai Hind.